Good evening and welcome back to our walk with Jesus as we continue on our journey to the cross. And we've come to Wednesday of Holy Week, but as we said last night, not much actually happens on the Wednesday. That's why it's called Silent Wednesday. So what we're going to draw on tonight is what happened on the Tuesday evening, what we didn't touch on yesterday, and that is Jesus' teaching about the future. After Jesus has finished his controversy with the religious leaders on Tuesday, he's leaving the temple in the evening time, and his disciples come to him, and they start to point out all of the grandeur and the splendor of the temple around them. It's said by the first century historian Flavius Josephus that the temple of Herod was far greater in splendor and majesty than even the temple in Solomon's day. But Jesus isn't interested in architecture. So he says to the disciples something incredibly shocking. He says, you see all of these buildings? Not one stone is going to be left upon another, but all of them will come crashing down. Jesus' disciples are in complete shock at what Jesus is saying because they believed, like most Jews in the first century, that Herod's temple was indestructible. They were completely taken aback by what Jesus said. And therefore, as they're walking across the Kidron Valley that evening, back up towards the Mount of Olives, they must have been asking themselves, what on earth is Jesus talking about? So we see that they come to him on the Mount of Olives, and they ask Jesus a question in private. They asked him, when will these things take place, and what will be the sign that everything will be accomplished? That's how Mark's Gospel and Luke asks the question. But Matthew gives a supplementary question from the disciples. They ask, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, it's so important that we don't import our later theology into the question that the disciples give to Jesus. Remember that the disciples have misunderstood Jesus' teaching right throughout. They don't know what it means by him coming to die and rise again. So it's very unlikely that they're talking about the actual second coming. That would have come through the later theology of Paul and others who taught about Jesus' return at the end of the age. What they mean by the end of the age and the sign of Jesus coming is when is he going to end Roman oppression and going to set up his earthly kingdom? We see in Matthew 24, in Mark 13 and Luke 21, different accounts of how Jesus answers that question. And it's really important for us to pay attention to what Jesus is saying to them so that we understand how that might apply to us today. Many people on social media today are drawing on scriptures to try and find a reason for the pandemic that we're going through. They'll turn to scriptures like this Olivet discourse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they'll read about wars and rumors of wars, famine and pestilence, and they'll point at what's going on today and they'll say that this was prophesied by what Jesus was telling the disciples. But unfortunately, I believe that misunderstands what Jesus is trying to teach them. Yes, in this passage, I believe that Jesus will go on from verse 36 of Matthew 24 to speak about his actual second coming. But that will be an event that is not accompanied by signs, but an event that will be like a thief in the night. An event that Jesus himself, as well as the angels, do not know when it will take place. So that means that what Jesus teaches his disciples from verse 4 right up to verse 35 of Matthew 24, which is the fullest of all the accounts, is actually speaking to his own generation about something they need to be aware of. And that thing that he's speaking about is what he's been speaking about for the last number of days of Holy Week, and that is the coming destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. It's important that we understand this so that we get the right focus for our own understanding of Jesus' second coming. Let me give you a few reasons tonight from what Jesus teaches why I believe that he's not speaking in those early verses about signs that will accompany his coming again. We see, first of all, that this is set in the context of what Jesus has been teaching right from the beginning. On Sunday and Palm Sunday, in Luke's account, as Jesus comes to the city, we see him lament over the city, and he talks about its coming destruction. Then on Monday, he curses the fig tree and also cleanses the temple, both indicating once again a coming destruction on that present system. Then again on Tuesday, when he's talking to the religious leaders, Jesus gives those parables that talk about their end and how the stone that the builders rejected would become the cornerstone. So everything in the context, including Jesus' woes over the Pharisees in chapter 23 of Matthew's gospel, point to what Jesus is talking about here. That he will tell the disciples, as he told those Pharisees, that the house of the Lord will be left desolate. Also, if you are a keen reader of the Old Testament, what you'll see is that Matthew's gospel is very much a close parallel to what we read in Ezekiel 10 and 11. In those passages, we read of how Yahweh went away from the first temple just before it was destroyed. And what's interesting is that this is the last time that we see Jesus leaving the temple. His glory has departed, and he will never return again. Also, there's a bit of an indication within the language of the text of Matthew 24 as to which period Jesus is talking about, what will be near future in the destruction of the temple, and about his own second coming at the end of time. We see, first of all, that when Jesus speaks in those early verses, he talks about those days, plural, and what will happen. But then from verse 36 onward, Jesus starts to speak about that day when his return will come like a thief in the night. Also, there are a couple of word changes that we don't really see in the English language that are there in the Greek that also indicate what Jesus is speaking about. The word that was most often used by the New Testament authors to speak of Jesus' actual second coming is the word parousia. But what we see here in verse 30 of chapter 24, what most people understand to be Jesus speaking of his second coming, about coming on a cloud, the Son of Man coming on a cloud. The word there is erchomemnon. And what's interesting is that that word is the same word that's used in the Greek translation of Daniel chapter 7 verse 13, where we see the Son of Man coming on a cloud. But what's really interesting is that in Daniel's context, the Son is coming on a cloud, not to earth at the end of time, but he's actually going up to the Ancient of Days in heaven to be enthroned. What Daniel is talking about is Jesus being vindicated, and that's what Jesus himself is telling the disciples, that he will be vindicated in heaven as the temple is destroyed on earth. What's interesting is that from verse 36 onward, the word that Jesus uses for his coming is that word parousia. Only once does he use it in the previous section in verse 27, and that to differentiate it from everything else that he's been talking about. The second thing that makes me believe that Jesus is speaking to his own generation when he talks about the signs that are to come is the fact that he addresses everything to his disciples. Notice that he uses the second personal pronoun over and over again. He tells them of what they need to see. You will see this. You will be killed. You will be hated. You are not to be frightened. Now, some people believe that what Jesus is speaking of here is the generic you, that he's speaking of some future generation to come. But that doesn't make sense to the context here. Plus, it also makes Jesus to be like the Max von Sydow version of him in The Greatest Story Ever Told, as if he's looking off into the ether and talking to some future generation. No, what Jesus is saying here is important for the disciples to listen to, because all that is coming is going to come upon them. We can see also from the language that he uses here that he's speaking to their particular situation. When Jesus says in those verses from 4 to 35, that they are not to come down from their roofs when they see all of this tribulation coming. Well, that doesn't make sense of our context. If I was to go up on my roof, I would slide off it quite quickly. But in first century Israel, the roofs were made flat. They were interconnected, the houses, to make an elevated highway that went right out to the city. So what Jesus is saying to his disciples is, when you see the Romans coming to the city and you're up on your roof, escape over this highway and get out as quickly as possible. Also, Jesus says that what's going to come upon the earth at this time, they are to pray, doesn't happen in winter on the Sabbath. Again, that's speaking to their own context, because in the first century, the winters could often be really harsh, and it made travel almost impossible as the roads were churned up. You couldn't escape on horse or chariot or even on foot. Also, when Jesus talks about it not happening on a Sabbath, that makes sense because in those days, on a Sabbath, the whole city was at a standstill, and it would be almost impossible to escape. If he's talking to our own context, what Sabbath is he talking about? As even in the church, people can't agree as to that particular day. No, Jesus is talking to his own generation about what they need to pay attention to. Also in these verses, Jesus speaks about a coming abomination of desolation. And when he speaks to his disciples, he says, let the reader understand. This isn't a note to us, the readers of Matthew. It's a note to the readers of Daniel as to what Jesus is talking about. You see, the abomination of desolation is mentioned twice in Daniel, in chapter 9 and chapter 11. And most scholars are agreed that what Daniel is talking about in Daniel 11 is what would happen 150 years before Jesus' birth, when a Syrian ruler called Antiochus Epiphanes would come and desecrate God's temple. This was a man who absolutely hated God's people, and he set up in the temple an abomination, the god Zeus, within this temple. And also he sacrificed pigs on the altar of burnt offering and slaughtered 40,000 of the Jews. So what Jesus is saying to the disciples, as we remember that he's addressing them, is that something similar is going to happen within their generation. The very thing that Daniel spoke about in chapter 9. An abomination of desolation would happen during the time of the Messiah's ministry, or just after. And what happened at the destruction of the temple, we see confirms everything that Jesus is saying. For the Roman general Titus would come riding into Jerusalem, much like Antiochus had done centuries before. And he would set up the Roman banners within the temple. He would start to offer false sacrifices and begin to slaughter the people, much as Antiochus had done. What Jesus is doing is preparing his disciples for this coming day, and to confirm that what Jesus is talking about happened in that century. In Luke 21:20, we're told that the disciples are told to look out for when the armies are surrounding Jerusalem, because then its desolation is near. Jesus is talking about specific locations and talking to specific people. But probably most clearly of all, the reason that I take verses 4 to 35, what often people assume to be Jesus' words about the second coming, to be speaking to his own generation, is that Jesus himself says that. In verse 34, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass away until all these things have been accomplished, or that they have happened. Jesus is saying it will happen in this generation. And throughout the New Testament, anytime those words are used, this generation, it always speaks of the generation to which Jesus himself is talking. The closest parallel is found in the previous chapter, chapter 23, when Jesus tells the religious leadership that all of the sin, all of the blood of the prophets will come upon this generation. So Jesus is warning them as to what's going to happen in their lifetime. And actually, a generation in the first century was seen to be around 40 years. And within 40 years, the temple would be destroyed. To confirm it further, in verse 35, Jesus says, heaven and earth may pass away, but my word will never pass away. Now, if Jesus is talking about the actual passing away of heaven and earth as its complete destruction, well, that would contradict what Paul says in Romans 8 about how God is going to restore this earth to its full glory, or to its redeemed glory. And also in the first century, the Jews would often speak of the temple as the meeting place of heaven and earth, that people could meet with the God of heaven on earth by coming to the temple. So what I believe Jesus is telling them is that even though the temple will be destroyed, the heaven and earth that they have now, his word will continue on, and they will know that they can continue to meet with God through him. Of course, the biggest problem for most people in taking what I say to be true is that in verse 29 of Matthew 24, it starts to talk about signs in heaven, about the moon being darkened and stars falling from heaven. And they say that didn't happen in the first century, so surely Jesus must be talking about what happens right at the end. But actually, if you know your Old Testaments again, you'll know that Jesus is drawing on language that was used in Isaiah and other prophets, particularly Isaiah 13:10 and also 34:4. The exact language Jesus uses here is used by the prophet to speak about the coming destruction of actual nations at the time, the nation of Babylon and the nation of Edom. So what Jesus is saying is that these signs that he's talking about in heaven will actually be the instruments to talk about the destruction of the sinful nation on earth. But I believe, as I have said, that Jesus begins in verse 36 to talk about his own second coming. And there Jesus said it won't be marked with signs that the people will know that the time is coming near, because he doesn't even know the time himself. In fact, he says it will be like in the day of Noah, when people were going about their ordinary business, marrying and giving in marriage right up to the point where the flood came. But Jesus warns them that they need to be prepared, but prepared in their lifestyle. So in chapter 25, Jesus goes on and he gives them 3 parables. The parables of the virgins, the parable of the tenants, and also of the sheep and the goats. And Jesus' message in each and every one of them is clear, that what is most important is how we live our lives now in light of his second coming. We shouldn't be sitting about thinking about what signs are marking Jesus' coming, even though we think that that's got great apologetic value, that we can point to something in Scripture and say it's happening now. Jesus is more interested in how we live our lives when he comes. And as he asks, will the Son of Man find faith when he comes again? That's for our reflection tonight. The question that we need to ask: have we become so obsessed about our social media output and telling people that certain things that are happening in the world today are found in particular scriptures? Or are we pointing people by our lives and by our attitude to the living Christ who will come again? Are we living lives that are pleasing to him, waiting for that day that none of us know when it will happen, but could come at any time? Are we prepared for him? I hope that you will join us again on Thursday night as we continue our walk with Jesus and that journey to the cross.
There's a place